girl woke to the sound of breathing that was not her own. It was 2:15 in the morning, and the room was black as pitch. She lay perfectly still beneath the coverlet, her pulse hammering in her throat, listening. The breathing was slow, measured, close enough that she could feel the faint displacement of air across her cheek. Then came the sound of metal, a soft, deliberate scraping like scissors being tested. Once, twice. The blades whispered against each other in the darkness. She tried to scream, but terror had stolen her voice. She felt the weight shift at the edge of her bed, felt the mattress dip slightly, and then, with a gentleness that was somehow worse than violence, she felt fingers lift a section of her hair. The scissors began to cut, snip, snip, snip. Each sound was crisp and purposeful in the silence. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying it was a nightmare, praying she would wake. But the cold metal continued its work, moving methodically across the back of her head, gathering locks with the care of a barber at his trade. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The weight lifted. Footsteps moved across the floorboards, unhurried, almost casual. The door opened with a faint creak and closed again with barely a sound. When she finally found the courage to move, to light the lamp with shaking hands, she discovered what he had taken. Great sections of her hair lay scattered across the pillow like dark ribbons, cut cleanly, deliberately, with professional precision. She was the third girl that month, and London in that autumn of 1922 was beginning to understand that something was stalking its daughters in the dark. Chapter 1: The City After Dark. Good evening and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now and the world has grown small around you. Wherever you are listening from, whatever hour marks your clock, let that time slip away for a moment. Let the present fade. We're about to step backward into a London that no longer exists except in memory and shadow. Before we begin our descent into this particular darkness, I wonder, where are you listening from tonight? What time has found you? Are you in bed, perhaps, with the lamp turned low? Or are you travelling through your own city streets, headphones shutting out the modern world? Wherever you are, you're welcome here. And if this is your first time joining us in these quiet hours, or if you have returned seeking another story from history's forgotten corners, consider subscribing to the Bedside Historian. There are many more tales waiting in the archives, and the night is always long enough for one more. Now then, let us drift backward through time, through the fog and gaslight, to a London still learning to live with its ghosts. The autumn of 1922 arrived in London with an unusual chill. The leaves turned early that year, browning and curling on the plane trees that lined the residential streets of South London, falling in. Drifts that gathered in doorways and against iron railings. The fog came up from the Thames most evenings, thick and yellow with coal smoke creeping through the narrow lanes and mews, muffling the sound of footsteps and carriage wheels. It was the kind of fog that made the city feel simultaneously vast and claustrophobic, as if one could walk forever through identical streets and never find the way home. London, in those years, still carried the weight of the Great War like a man carrying an invisible wound. 4 years had passed since the armistice, but the city had not recovered. How could it? Nearly 1 million British men had died in the trenches. Another 1.5 million had returned broken in body or mind, or both. The victory had been won, but the cost had been almost too terrible to comprehend. Every family knew loss. Every street had its widows. Every park had its men in hospital blue, learning to walk again on artificial limbs or staring at nothing with eyes that had seen too much. The women of London had changed too. During the war, they had worked in munitions factories, driven ambulances, served as nurses in field hospitals where the floors ran red. They'd kept the buses running and the shops open, and the country fed while the men were away dying. And when those men came home, or did not come home, the women had not simply returned to the parlours and drawing rooms of the previous century. They moved through the streets with a new kind of independence, worked in offices as typists and clerks, cut their hair short in the new fashion, wore skirts that showed their ankles. The world had shifted on its axis, and there was no putting it back. But independence came with its own vulnerabilities. In the working-class neighbourhoods south of the river, Clapham, Brixton, Streatham, Balham, young women lived in boarding houses and rented rooms, away from family, earning their own wages. They walked home alone at night from their positions in shops and offices, their heels clicking on the pavement, their breath misting in the cold air. They carried latchkeys in their handbags, let themselves into dark hallways, climbed narrow stairs to rooms where a gas fire could be lit for a penny in the meter. They were modern women in a city that was still, in many ways, Victorian in its bones. The streets they walked were lit by gas lamps that cast pools of sickly yellow light at irregular intervals, leaving great stretches of darkness in between. Electric lighting existed, of course, but it was expensive, the province of the West End and the grand thoroughfares. In the residential areas, the lamplighter still made his rounds at dusk, using his long pole to open the valve and strike the flame. And in the small hours before dawn, another man would come to turn them off again, plunging the streets back into darkness until morning. The houses themselves were mostly Victorian terraces, built in long rows of identical brick facades 3 or 4 stories high, with basements below street level and attics tucked under slate roofs. They had been constructed for the respectable middle classes of the previous century, but by 1922 many had been subdivided into flats and bedsits. A single house might contain 6 or 7 separate households, each renting a room or 2, sharing a WC on the landing, cooking on gas rings in their chambers. Privacy was a luxury. Walls were thin, sounds travelled. The windows of these houses were the tall sash kind, with wooden frames that swelled and warped with the damp. The locks, if they existed at all, were often simple brass latches that could be worked open from outside with a thin blade or a bit of wire. Many residents, especially those on ground floors or basements, kept their windows latched but not locked, needing the ventilation in rooms that could grow stuffy and close. It was not uncommon to leave a window open an inch or 2 even on cold nights, just for the circulation of air. London had always had its dangers, of course. Every city did. There were pickpockets in the markets and footpads in the parks. There were areas one did not venture into after dark, streets where the police walked in pairs. But the nature of crime was changing in ways that unsettled the public consciousness. The war had produced a generation of men skilled in violence, accustomed to moving silently, trained in the arts of stealth and infiltration. Some of them had returned to civilian life unable to forget those skills or unwilling to set them aside. The newspapers of the period were full of anxieties about social disorder, moral decay, the breakdown of traditional structures. There were strikes and labour unrest. There were fears about Bolshevism spreading from Russia. There were scandals involving drugs and nightclubs and the younger generation running wild. The old certainties had dissolved in the mud of Flanders, and no one was quite sure what would replace them. Into this unsettled atmosphere, in the early weeks of October 1922, came the first whispers of something new, something that did not fit the usual categories of crime or violence, something that operated according to a logic no one could understand. A girl in Clapham reported waking to find her hair cut short, then another girl in Brixton, then a third in Streatham, each time the same strange details. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, no theft of money or jewellery, only hair, taken in the night while the victim slept, cut with what must have been very sharp scissors, removed so carefully that most of the girls did not wake until it was over. At first, the incidents were treated as isolated pranks, the work of jealous roommates or spiteful acquaintances. But as more reports came in, as the pattern became clear, the authorities began to realise they were dealing with something else entirely. Someone was entering the homes of young women, moving through their rooms while they slept, and performing this strange, intimate violation with a skill that suggested practice and planning. The police took statements. Detectives visited the scenes. But there was almost nothing to investigate. No fingerprints, that science was still in its infancy. No witnesses who saw anyone entering or leaving, no physical evidence beyond the severed locks of hair, which the intruder always took with him, leaving only the shortest remnants scattered on pillows and floors. And so the fear began to spread through South London like a contagion. Women began checking their windows twice before bed, pushing wardrobes against doors, asking landlords to install better locks. Some took to sleeping with scissors under their pillows or hat pins or small hammers. Others moved back home with parents or found friends to share rooms with. Strength in numbers. The fog rolled in each evening and the gas lamps flickered. And somewhere in the darkness a man moved through the city with purposes known only to himself. The girls slept, or tried to sleep, and listened to every creak and groan of the old houses settling, every footstep in the street outside, and every sound that might be a window being worked open in the dark. London held its breath and waited to see what the night would bring. The newspapers, sensing a story that would sell copies, began to pay attention, and when the newspapers gave something a name, it took on a life of its own, became something more than the sum of its parts. They called him the Phantom Barber, and in doing so they made him into something almost mythical, a figure from a ghost story, a shadow that could slip through walls and vanish without trace. But he was not a phantom. He was a man. Somewhere in the city of 8 million souls he lived and worked and moved among his fellow citizens. He might pass a woman on the street and she would never know. He might live in the same building, sleep in the next room, and the walls between them would be as thin as paper. That was perhaps the most unsettling thought of all, that he was not some supernatural entity but simply human, that the horror came not from the otherworldly, but from the ordinary fact of another person, with hands and breath and intent, choosing to do what he did. The autumn deepened into November, and the nights grew longer, and the mystery of the Phantom Barber was only beginning. Chapter 2. The First Cutting. The girl's name was Emily Colquhoun, and she was 17 years old. She worked as a shop assistant at a draper's establishment on Clapham High Street, measuring out yards of fabric and matching thread colours for the housewives and seamstresses who came through the door. She lived in a boarding house on Rectory Grove, a narrow street lined with plane trees and Victorian terraces that had seen better days. Her room was on the ground floor, the back of the house, looking out onto a small walled garden where the landlady grew roses in the summer and nothing much in the winter. Emily paid 12 shillings a week for the room, which included breakfast and use of the shared bathroom on the first floor landing. It was not much: a narrow bed, a wardrobe, a small table and chair by the window, a gas fire that ate pennies at an alarming rate. But it was hers. She had lived there for 6 months, since leaving her parents' home in Croydon to take the position at the Drapers. It was her first taste of independence, and despite the loneliness that sometimes crept in on Sunday evenings, she cherished it. She had been blessed with beautiful hair. Everyone said so. It fell past her shoulders in thick waves the colour of dark honey, the kind of hair that caught the light and seemed almost to glow. She wore it in 2 long plaits during the day, pinned up under her work cap at the shop, then let down and brushed before bed each night. 100 strokes, as her mother had taught her. It was a ritual she rarely missed. On the night of October 7th, 1922, Emily came home from work just after 7 in the evening. It had been a long day. Her feet ached from standing on the shop floor, and her fingers were sore from cutting fabric and tying parcels. She had missed her tea break because a difficult customer had insisted on seeing every bolt of blue serge in the stockroom, and by the time Emily climbed the steps to her boarding house, she wanted nothing more than to eat something warm and go to sleep. The landlady, Mrs. Dwyer, had left a cold supper on the hall table, bread and cheese and a small piece of ham wrapped in paper. Emily took it to her room, ate mechanically while sitting on the edge of her bed, then changed into her nightdress and brushed out her hair. The window was slightly ajar as she always left it. The room grew stuffy otherwise, and she could not sleep in stuffy rooms. She said her prayers, turned down the lamp, and slipped beneath the blankets. The sheets were cold. It took several minutes for her body heat to warm them. She could hear the sounds of the house settling around her. Footsteps on the floor above, the distant clank of pipes. The murmur of voices from the front parlour, where some of the other lodgers were taking their evening tea. Ordinary sounds, familiar sounds. They lulled her towards sleep. She did not hear the window being opened wider. She did not hear the soft scrape of a shoe on the sill. She did not hear the intruder enter her room and stand there in the darkness, listening to her breathing, waiting for it to slow and deepen into the rhythm of true sleep. What she did hear, much later in the night, was the sound of metal whispering against metal, a sound so quiet it might have been part of a dream. She surfaced slightly from sleep, confused, her mind still half tangled in whatever she had been dreaming. The sound came again, a soft, deliberate snipping. She opened her eyes. The room was utterly dark. The lamp was out. The curtains were drawn. There was no moonlight, no streetlight penetrating the gloom. But she could sense a presence, could feel the displacement of air that meant another body occupied the space near her bed. Terror flooded through her like ice water. She tried to scream, but her throat had closed. She tried to move, but her limbs would not obey. It was the paralysis of nightmare, the sensation of being trapped in one's own body while something terrible approached. She felt fingers in her hair, gentle fingers. They lifted a section of her plait with what almost seemed like tenderness, holding it away from her head. And then the scissors began their work. Snip, snip, snip. Each cut was clean and purposeful. The intruder worked methodically, moving from one side of her head to the other, gathering sections of hair and severing them close to the scalp. Emily lay frozen, tears streaming down her face, unable to make a sound. The gentleness of it was somehow worse than violence would have been. There was a carefulness to the cutting, a precision that suggested this was not random vandalism, but something performed with intent and skill. It seemed to last forever. In reality, it probably took no more than 3 or 4 minutes. When the cutting stopped, Emily heard the soft rustle of the severed hair being gathered up. She heard footsteps moving toward the window. She heard the window being pulled down to its previous position, almost but not quite closed. And then silence. She lay there in the dark, shaking for a long time before she found the courage to move. When she finally sat up and fumbled for the matches to light the lamp, her hands were trembling so badly it took 3 attempts to strike a flame. The light revealed the damage. Her beautiful plaits were gone. What remained was a ragged, uneven crop that barely reached her collar. Strands of hair lay scattered across her pillow like dark ribbons, but most of it had been taken. The intruder had gathered up his harvest and carried it away with him. Emily stared at her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand and began to scream. Mrs. Dwyer came running along with several other lodgers. They found Emily sitting on her bed, still screaming, clutching at the ruins of her hair. It took some time to calm her enough to understand what she was saying. When they finally grasped what had happened, when they saw the evidence scattered on the bedclothes, a different kind of alarm rippled through the household. Someone had been in the house, had entered a lodger's room while she slept, had done this strange, inexplicable thing. And if he could do this, what else might he be capable of? The police were summoned. A constable arrived within the hour, notebook in hand, taking down the details with the weary efficiency of a man who had seen stranger things during his years on the force. But even he seemed unsettled by the peculiar nature of the crime. Nothing stolen, no assault, just hair, taken in the night. He examined the window and found no signs of forced entry. The latch had been worked, opened from outside, probably with a thin blade slipped between the sashes. It was a simple enough trick if one knew how. The lock itself was old and loose, the kind that could be manipulated without much effort. Had Miss Colquhoun seen the intruder? Could she describe him? The room had been too dark. She had only sensed him, heard him, felt his hands in her hair. Had she heard him speak? Any distinctive sounds, breathing patterns, anything at all that might identify him? He had been silent except for the scissors, and even those had been nearly soundless, just the faintest whisper of blade against blade. The constable made notes, He advised Mrs. Dwyer to ensure all windows were properly secured. He suggested Emily might want to speak with a doctor about something to help her sleep given the shock, and then he left, promising the matters would be investigated. But what was there to investigate? No witnesses, no evidence, no clear motives. The incident was filed away with the other minor crimes that occurred daily in a city of 8 million. Life went on. Emily Colquhoun returned to work at the Drapers after 3 days. She wore a close-fitting hat to hide her shorn hair, and she never spoke of what had happened. But those who knew her said she was changed. She no longer smiled easily. She no longer lingered after closing time to chat with the other girls. She went home before dark and stayed there, and she never again slept with her window open, not even in the heat of summer. Within 2 weeks, another girl reported the same violation, and then another. And by the end of October, the police began to understand they were dealing not with an isolated incident, but with a pattern. Someone was moving through South London, selecting victim according to criteria known only to himself, and taking from them something that had no monetary value but tremendous personal significance. The newspapers got hold of the story in early November. The first article appeared in the South London Press, a small notice buried on page 4, but the story was too strange, too unsettling to remain buried. Within days it had spread to the larger dailies, and once the Fleet Street papers took an interest, the case of the Phantom Barber became the sensation of the season. Chapter 3: The Spreading Fear. By the middle of November, 10 young women had reported the same violation. 10 separate incidents, all following the same pattern, all occurring in a roughly 3-mile radius centred on Clapham Common. The attacks came always in the deepest part of the night, between 2 and 4 in the morning, when sleep was heaviest and the streets were emptiest. The victims were always alone, always living on ground floors or in basement flats, always with windows that could be accessed from street level or via a short climb. Scotland Yard assigned the case to Detective Inspector William Morrison, a man of 43 years who had served on the force since before the war. Morrison had investigated murders and robberies, arsons and frauds. He had dealt with violent criminals and cunning thieves, but this case confounded him in ways that more serious crimes had not. There was no violence, no theft in the conventional sense, no sexual assault, though the intimate nature of the intrusion suggested some form of perverse gratification. Just hair, cleanly cut and carefully removed, taken from sleeping women who woke to find themselves violated in a manner the law struggled to categorize. Was it assault? Technically, perhaps, though no physical harm was done beyond the cutting itself. Was it burglary? But nothing of value was stolen. Was it trespass? Certainly. But trespass alone did not warrant the resources Morrison was directing toward the investigation. What troubled him most, what kept him awake in his own bed at night, was the skill involved. This was not the work of a clumsy amateur. The intruder moved through houses without waking anyone except his intended victim, and often not even her until the cutting was underway. He navigated unfamiliar rooms in complete darkness. He worked quickly and efficiently, always departing before discovery, and he left behind almost no evidence. Morrison interviewed each victim personally. He took detailed statements, examined the locations, studied the methods of entry. Patterns began to emerge. The victims were all between 16 and 24 years old. All had long hair worn loose or in plaits. All lived in modest circumstances, working girls rather than women of means. All were what society termed respectable. No actresses, no women of questionable reputation, no one who might invite such attention through unconventional behaviour. The geographic pattern was also revealing. The incidents clustered around specific neighbourhoods: Clapham, Brixton, Streatham, with a few outliers in Balham and Tooting. These were areas of mixed respectability, where working class and lower middle class families lived side by side in converted Victorian houses. Streets where a man might walk without attracting notice, where the population was transient enough that strangers were common. Morrison requested additional patrols in the affected areas. Constables walked the streets in the small hours, watching for suspicious behaviour, but the intruder seemed to know when and where the police would be. He struck only on nights when patrols were light or routes were predictable, It was almost as if he had inside knowledge of police operations, or at least a keen understanding of their patterns. The newspapers, of course, made everything worse. What had begun as factual reporting quickly descended into sensationalism. Artists drew lurid illustrations of shadowy figures climbing through windows, scissors gleaming in the moonlight. Writers penned breathless accounts full of gothic atmosphere and barely condoled titillation. The phantom barber became a figure of dark romance, a mistress villain who haunted the dreams of young women across London. The Daily Mail ran a series of articles speculating on the phantom's identity and motives. Was he a deranged hairdresser, driven mad by some professional slight? A shell-shocked veteran acting out some incomprehensible trauma from the trenches? A collector of unusual trophies, building some macabre private museum? A man with peculiar sexual proclivities, satisfying desires that could not be spoken aloud in respectable society? The coverage sold newspapers by the thousands, but it also created an atmosphere of hysteria that made Morrison's work infinitely more difficult. Every man who walked alone at night became suspect. Every unfamiliar face in a neighbourhood drew scrutiny. The police received dozens of reports daily. Suspicious characters lurking near windows, strange men asking about single women, shadowy figures seen climbing over back garden walls. Morrison and his men investigated every report. They interviewed dozens of men who matched vague descriptions or had tenuous connections to the affected areas. They questioned barbers and hairdressers, army veterans with unstable records, known criminals with histories of housebreaking. They followed leads that inevitably dissolved into nothing. Meanwhile, the fear grew. Women who lived alone began taking extreme precautions. They installed new locks and window bars. They adopted large dogs or found male relatives willing to sleep in parlours. They formed neighbourhood watch groups, taking turns to stay awake and alert through the dangerous hours. Some moved away entirely, returning to parents or relocating to different parts of the city where the phantom had not yet struck. The economic impact was not negligible. Boarding houses in South London found it difficult to attract single female lodgers. Property owners complained of vacancies. Landlords installed better security at their own expense, hoping to reassure potential tenants. Local businesses that catered to working women saw their custom decline as young women chose to return home rather than maintain independence in neighbourhoods that no longer felt safe. The social impact was perhaps even more significant. The idea of women living alone, working independently, moving through the city without male protection. This had been one of the hard-won changes of the war years. But the Phantom Barber called that independence into cold question. He made the simple act of sleeping in one's own bed feel dangerous. He turned private abuses into sites of potential violation. He reminded London that women, no matter how modern or independent, remained vulnerable in ways that men were not. Some commentators used the case to argue for a return to traditional arrangements. Young women should live with family, they said, until marriage. They should not take rooms alone in boarding houses. They should not walk home after dark or work in positions that kept them out late. The Phantom Barber in this telling was a symptom of social disorder, a punishment visited upon women who had stepped too far outside their proper sphere. Others saw it differently. The problem was not female independence, but inadequate policing, insufficient street lighting, poor housing security. The solution was not to confine women, but to make the city safer for everyone through better urban planning and more effective law enforcement. But neither argument helped Morrison catch his man. The weeks passed and the incidents continued, and the intruder remained as elusive as smoke. On the 23rd of November, a girl named Margaret Hines woke to find her hair being cut. Unlike most of the previous victims, Margaret had the presence of mind to grab at the intruder's arm. She felt fabric, rough wool like a workman's coat. She felt a hand, strong and calloused. And then the man wrenched free and was gone, out through the window before she could even sit up. Morrison interviewed her extensively. The wool coat suggested a labourer or tradesman, not a gentleman. The calloused hand supported that theory. But those details applied to thousands of men in London. It was something, but not enough. The next attack came 3 nights later, then another, then 2 in one night in separate neighbourhoods miles apart. Morrison began to wonder if there might be more than one perpetrator, copycat criminals inspired by the newspaper coverage. Or perhaps the attacks had always been the work of multiple men, and the press had simply imposed a single narrative on unrelated incidents. But the consistency of method argued against that theory. The same careful technique, the same selection of victims, the same mysterious absence of violence or theft. If these were separate men, they were working from the same template, following the same inexplicable logic. December arrived, and with it came the shortest days of the year. Darkness fell by 4:30 in the afternoon, and did not lift until after 8 the next morning. The city existed in a state of perpetual twilight, and the fog grew thicker, and the phantom barber continued his strange harvest. 15 victims, then 17, then 20. The police seemed powerless to stop him. Morrison worked 18-hour days following leads that led nowhere, interviewing witnesses who had seen nothing useful. His superiors pressed him for results. The newspapers mocked the ineffectiveness of Scotland Yard. The public's faith in law enforcement began to erode, and still the man came in the night, scissors in hand, moving through the darkness with the confidence of someone who knew he would not be caught. Chapter 4. The method of the phantom. Scotland Yard established a special operations room dedicated solely to the phantom barber investigation. A large map of South London covered one wall, marked with pins indicating each attack site, red for confirmed incidents, yellow for suspected but unverified reports. By early December, the map looked like a constellation, a spreading galaxy of violations across the neighbourhood south of the Thames. Detective Inspector Morrison stood before that map for hours, studying the pattern, trying to discern some logic in the distribution. The pins did not form random scatter. There was structure here, intention. The attacks moved in rough arcs, sweeping through one area before shifting to the next. Clapham first, then Brixton, then Streatham, then back toward Balham. A predator working through territory, perhaps, or a man whose work or residence required travel through these specific neighbourhoods. Morrison's team compiled detailed files on each victim. Photographs, physical descriptions, daily routines, employment details, social connections. They looked for commonalities beyond the obvious factors of age and appearance. Did the women shop at the same markets, attend the same churches, ride the same bus routes, work for the same employers? Some connections emerged, but they were tenuous. 3 victims bought fabric from the same draper's shop. 2 attended evening classes at the Streatham Technical Institute. 4 worked in offices along the same stretch of High Street. But there were always exceptions. Women who fit none of these patterns yet suffered the same violation. The phantom selection criteria remained opaque. The method of entry showed more consistency. In 19 of the 23 confirmed cases, the intruder had entered through ground floor windows with simple sash locks. In 3 cases, he had used basement windows accessed via area steps. In one instance, the most daring, he had climbed to a first-floor window using a drainpipe and ledge. He understood locks and windows with the familiarity of someone who had studied them extensively or worked with them professionally. Morrison interviewed locksmiths, window fitters, builders who specialised in Victorian conversions. He inquired about men who might have acquired such knowledge through legitimate trade but exhibited unusual behaviour or suspicious interest in women's lodgings. Several names surfaced, but investigation cleared each one. The locksmith had been in hospital during 3 of the attacks. The window fitter was 60 years old and suffered from arthritis that made climbing impossible. The builder had moved to Birmingham in September. The scissors themselves offered another avenue of investigation. Morrison consulted with barbers and hairdressers about the type of blade that would produce such clean cuts. The consensus was professional equipment, well-maintained and sharp. Not household sewing scissors or the blunt shears found in most domestic settings. The phantom used tools designed specifically for cutting hair, and he knew how to use them properly. This led Morrison to focus on London's hairdressing community. There were hundreds of barbers in South London alone, from established gentlemen's salons to small shops serving working-class customers to travelling barbers who worked from portable kits. Morrison's men visited them all, asking questions, taking notes, watching for reactions that might suggest guilt or specialised knowledge. Most were cooperative, even sympathetic. The Phantom Barber case was bad for business. Women were growing suspicious of any man who worked with scissors and hair. Trade was down across the profession. They wanted the intruder caught as badly as anyone. One name appeared multiple times in interviews: Gerald Simmons, a 40-year-old barber who had worked at several establishments in the affected areas before abruptly closing his own small shop in October. Simmons had served in the war as a field medic, had returned with what his former colleagues delicately termed nervous troubles. He lived alone in a bedsit in Brixton. He had been seen walking the streets at odd hours. Several people described him as withdrawn, unsettling, a man who stared too long at women with long hair. Morrison brought Simmons in for questioning. The man was pale and thin, with trembling hands and eyes that never quite met Morrison's gaze. He denied any involvement in the attacks. He claimed his nighttime walks were simply insomnia, a symptom of his war experience. He produced receipts showing his scissors had been pawned in September due to financial difficulties. He had witnesses who could account for his whereabouts during several of the attacks. Morrison pressed him hard. The interrogation lasted 6 hours, moving from patient questioning to aggressive confrontation and back again. But Simmons never broke. His story remained consistent. His alibi held. And when Morrison finally checked with the pawnbroker, the scissors were indeed there, tagged and dated September the 15th, weeks before the first attack. Simmons was released with apologies. He left the police station a free man, but a ruined one. The newspapers had already reported his questioning. Neighbours who had been merely wary now treated him with outright hostility. He moved away within the month, and Morrison never learned what became of him. Just another life damaged by proximity to the case. The investigation turned to other theories. Perhaps the Phantom was not a professional barber at all, but someone who had learned the skill for this specific purpose. Perhaps he had practiced on wigs or dolls before attempting his first real victim. Perhaps he had studied barbers at work, absorbed their techniques through observations alone. Morrison's men visited wig makers and theatrical suppliers. They inquired about anyone purchasing practice equipment or asking unusual questions about haircutting. They found nothing of use. Another theory suggested the Phantom might be a medical man. Doctors and medical students understood anatomy, could move with precision in darkness, had access to sharp instruments. Several medical professionals in South London came under scrutiny. Their movements were tracked, their backgrounds investigated, their associations examined. But again, nothing connected any of them to the attacks. The psychological profile, such as it was, remained frustratingly vague. Alienists, the psychological specialists of the era, offered various explanations. Some suggested fetishism, a sexual disorder in which arousal became attached to specific objects or body parts. Hair had long been understood as having a particular erotic significance. Victorian literature was full of references to women's hair as a symbol of femininity and sexual allure. Perhaps the Phantom was a man who could not approach women in normal ways, and so took from them the one thing he desired through stealth and violation. Others proposed trauma as the root cause. The war had produced thousands of men with damaged minds. Shell shocks, or otherwise what a later generation would call post-traumatic stress disorder, manifested in strange and unpredictable ways. Perhaps the Phantom was a veteran acting out some symbolic ritual connected to experiences in the trenches. Perhaps cutting hair allowed him to exert control in a way he had been unable to during the chaos of battle. Perhaps the gentleness of his method reflected a desperate attempt to avoid the violence he had witnessed or committed. During the war, still others suggested the Phantom might be motivated not by desire or trauma, but by anger. Anger at women's growing independence, anger at social changes that threaten traditional masculine authority. The act of cutting hair could be understood as a symbolic act of dominance, a way of literally cutting women down, of taking from them something that enhanced their attractiveness and confidence. In this reading, the Phantom was making a statement about gender and power, using scissors instead of words. Morrison found these theories interesting but ultimately unhelpful. Understanding why the Phantom did what he did might be useful for prevention or treatment after capture, but it did not help Morrison find him. What he needed was not psychological insight but physical evidence, reliable witnesses, a mistake that would expose the man behind the crimes. That mistake seemed never to come. The Phantom worked with a discipline that suggested either great intelligence or great caution, or both. He varied his timing enough to avoid predictable patterns. He never struck the same street twice. He left no personal items behind, no traces of his passage beyond the evidence of the cutting itself. It was as if he understood exactly what the police would look for, and took care to provide none of it. By mid-December, Morrison had conducted over 200 interviews, followed dozens of leads, and made no meaningful progress toward identifying the perpetrator. The case files filled an entire cabinet. The man-hours invested ran into the thousands, and still women woke in terror to find their hair taken. Still the Phantom moved through South London with impunity. Still the public's fear and anger grew. Morrison began to understand that he might never catch this man, that the case might join the long list of unsolved crimes that haunted Scotland Yard's archives, that somewhere in London, the Phantom Barber would eventually stop his attacks and fade back into ordinary life, his identity forever unknown, his victim forever without answers or justice. It was not an outcome Morrison could accept. But as December wore on and the winter darkness deepened, it was becoming increasingly difficult to imagine any other resolution. Chapter 5. The City Holds Its Breath. The newspapers had turned the case into a national obsession. By the third week of December, hardly a day passed without some publication running a story about the Phantom Barber. The Times maintained its usual restraint, relegating coverage to brief factual updates buried in the crime section. But the popular press showed no such reserve. The Daily Mail ran illustrated features showing young women cowering in their beds while shadowy figures loomed at windows. The Daily Mirror published interviews with victims, their faces photographed in profile to show the damage done to their hair. The Evening Standard offered a reward of £50 for information leading to arrest. Smaller papers competed with ever more sensational headlines. The Scissor Fiend strikes again. Phantom terror grips South London. Will no woman be safe until he's caught? The coverage had effects that rippled far beyond the immediate victims. In drawing rooms across London, mothers forbade their daughters from taking independent lodgings. In offices and shops, managers received notice from female employees who could no longer bear to live alone in the affected neighbourhoods. In Parliament, questions were raised about police competence and public safety. The Home Secretary found himself defending Scotland Yard's efforts while privately pressing the Commissioner for results. The public's imagination seized upon the case with an intensity that surprised even seasoned observers of popular culture. There was something about the peculiar nature of the crime that captured attention in ways that straightforward violence did not. Murder was comprehensible, robbery understandable, even sexual assault fit within known categories of human depravity. But this strange, gentle, inexplicable violation operated according to a logic that defied normal understanding. Music hall comedians incorporated the Phantom into their routines, drawing nervous laughter from audiences who wanted to diffuse their fear through humour. Street vendors sold cheap illustrated pamphlets purporting to tell the true story, though these bore little relation to actual facts. A theatrical producer announced plans for a sensational stage play, though public outcry forced him to abandon the project before rehearsals began. The case became a lens through which broader social anxieties were refracted and examined. Columnists used it to debate women's independence, urban moral decay, the lingering effects of war trauma. Clergymen preached sermons about the case, drawing lessons about sin and retribution, safety and vulnerability, the breakdown of Christian values in modern society. Medical journals published articles about psychological disorders and criminal pathology, using the phantom as a case study for emerging theories about deviant behaviour. But beneath all the commentary and speculation and cultural appropriation, there remained the simple fact of women living in fear. And that fear changed how South London functioned. The streets after dark became territories to be navigated with extreme caution. Women who had once walked home confidently from evening engagements now hired taxicabs or arranged for male escorts. Those who could not afford such luxuries travelled in groups, never alone, planning their routes to avoid poorly lit stretches. The social geography of the city shifted as certain streets and neighbourhoods acquired reputations as dangerous zones to be avoided after sunset. Businesses adjusted to the new reality. Shops that had routinely stayed open until 8 or 9 in the evening began closing at 6. Employers reluctantly accepted that female staff needed to leave work before full darkness fell. Evening classes at technical institutes saw attendance plummet among women students. Church groups that met in the evenings moved their gatherings to afternoon hours. The market for home security equipment flourished. Ironmongers reported unprecedented demand for window locks, door chains, sliding bolts. One enterprising manufacturer introduced a special window alarm that would sound if a sash was raised more than 3 inches. Another developed a wedge device that could be hammered into window frames to prevent them opening from outside. These products sold briskly despite their cost. The community response varied by neighbourhood. In some areas, residents organised watch patrols, men taking turns to walk the streets during the dangerous hours between midnight and dawn. They carried whistles and walking sticks, empowered by nothing more than community agreement to challenge suspicious persons. The police tolerated these patrols uneasily, grateful for the extra eyes but concerned about vigilante excess. In other neighbourhoods, the response was more passive but no less significant. Lights stayed on in windows all night. Families that had previously retired early now kept someone awake and alert until morning. Dogs that had once slept quietly in back gardens were brought inside, their barking welcomed as a warning system. The normal rhythms of domestic life were disrupted by the need for constant vigilance. Women developed their own strategies for managing the fear. Some slept fully dressed, ready to flee at the first sign of intrusion. Others arranged furniture to barricade doors, creating obstacles that would slow an intruder and provide warning. Still others acquired weapons of a sort, knitting, needles sharpened to points, heavy candlesticks kept beside beds, bottles of ammonia that could be thrown in an attacker's face. The psychological toll was difficult to measure, but undeniably real. Doctors reported increased consultations for insomnia and nervous complaints among young women. Pharmacists dispensed more sleeping drafts and nerve tonics. Those who could afford it sought help from the new psychological practitioners, talking through their fears in consulting rooms far from the threatened neighbourhoods. The victims themselves struggled with a peculiar kind of trauma. They had not been physically harmed in ways that left visible scars. They had not been robbed of anything that could be assigned monetary value, but they had been violated in their most private space during their most vulnerable moments, by a man whose face they had never seen and whose motives they could not understand. How did one process such an experience? How did one explain it to family or friends or potential employers who might see it as somehow shameful or compromising? Many of the women found it impossible to continue living in the rooms where the attacks had occurred. Even after installing better locks, even after moving furniture and changing routines, the space itself felt contaminated. They could not sleep there without reliving the moment of waking to find a stranger's hands in their hair. They moved away, taking losses on rent deposits and breaking lease agreements, accepting whatever financial penalty necessary to escape the memories. But moving did not necessarily bring peace. The fear travelled with them. Every creak of floorboards in a new lodging brought the heart-racing certainty that he had found them again. Every shadow at a window suggested his return. The phantom had taken more than hair. He had taken the fundamental sense of safety that allowed people to rest peacefully in their own beds. The families of victims struggled with their own forms of guilt and anger. Parents who had reluctantly allowed daughters to live independently now blamed themselves for permitting such arrangements. Brothers and male friends castigated themselves for not providing better protection. The attacks exposed the uncomfortable truth that women's independence existed on sufferance, contingent on circumstances remaining safe, vulnerable to disruption by any threat that specifically targeted them. Some families responded by reasserting control. Daughters were summoned home and forbidden to return to independent living. Engagements were accelerated so that women could move directly from parental protection to marital protection without the dangerous interval of living alone. The progress toward female independence that had seemed so inevitable in the optimistic years immediately after the war now appeared fragile, easily reversed by fear. Other families took a different approach, supporting their daughters' determination to maintain independence despite the risk. They helped pay for better lodgings with superior security. They purchased the expensive new window locks and alarm systems. They arranged for regular check-ins and emergency protocols. They refused to let the phantom's actions dictate their daughters' lives. But both approaches shared an underlying acknowledgement of vulnerability. Women could not simply go about their lives as men could. They required extra precautions, additional safeguards, constant awareness of potential threats. The Phantom had reminded London that half its population lived with a fundamental insecurity that the other half rarely needed to consider. Detective Inspector Morrison understood all of this. He read the newspaper coverage and the victim impact statements. He spoke with families and witnessed their fear and anger and helplessness. And he knew that every day without an arrest strengthened the Phantom's hold over the city's imagination. The pressure from his superiors intensified. The Commissioner wanted results. The Home Secretary wanted results. The public wanted results. But wanting did not make them appear. Morrison worked longer hours, pursued ever more tenuous leads, grasped at straws that disintegrated under scrutiny. His marriage suffered under the strain. His wife complained that he never came home anymore, and when he did, he was too exhausted to speak or think about anything but the case. His health deteriorated. He lost weight, developed a persistent cough, noticed his hands shaking when he tried to write reports late at night. But he could not stop, could not set the case aside and accept defeat. Somewhere in London, the Phantom was preparing for his next attack. Somewhere a woman was going about her evening routine, unaware that tonight she would be chosen, and Morrison had no way to stop it from happening. The winter solstice passed. Christmas approached. The city decorated itself with evergreen boughs and coloured lights, attempting to maintain normal seasonal traditions despite the fear that infected the southern neighbourhoods. Carol singers still went door to door, though women's groups now travelled only in the early evening and always with male accompaniment. Church services were well attended, people seeking comfort in ritual and community. On the evening of December the 23rd, Morrison stood in his operations room staring at the map with its constellation of red pins. 26 confirmed attacks now, 26 women violated, and he was no closer to identifying the perpetrator than he had been after the first incident in October. The latest attack had occurred the previous night in Tooting, a neighbourhood that had previously been spared. The victim was a 19-year-old typist named Alice Thornton. She had woken to find half her hair gone, cut away with the same methodical precision that characterised all the other incidents. The intruder had entered through a ground-floor window, worked in complete darkness, and departed without trace. Morrison had interviewed Alice that morning. She was still in shock, unable to articulate much beyond the basic facts. Yes, she had felt his presence. Yes, she had heard the scissors. No, she had seen nothing, remembered no details that might identify him. She was the 26th victim, but her experience added nothing new to Morrison's understanding of the case. As Morrison stood before the map, studying the pattern of attacks, his sergeant entered the room carrying the evening papers. The headlines were predictable. Phantom strikes again. Police helpless as terror continues. When will Scotland Yard act? Morrison took the papers without reading them. He had stopped reading the coverage weeks ago. It served no purpose except to deepen his sense of failure. The sergeant cleared his throat. "Sir, there's a demonstration scheduled for tomorrow evening. Women's groups and some of the victims' families. They're marching to Scotland Yard to demand action." Morrison nodded wearily. He had expected something of the sort. The public's patience had limits, and those limits had been exceeded. "Post extra men at the entrances," he said. "Make sure it stays peaceful, and prepare a statement for the press. The usual assurances about progress and dedication." The sergeant departed, leaving Morrison alone with his map and his failure. Outside, the December darkness had fallen hours ago. Somewhere in that darkness, the phantom was moving through his world, perhaps planning his next violation, perhaps already at work. And London held its breath and waited to see who would wake tomorrow morning to find themselves his latest victim. Chapter 6. Theories and Shadows. The investigation files had grown enormous. 3 large cabinets now housed the accumulated documentation of Morrison's efforts: interview transcripts, forensic reports, witness statements, tip sheets, suspect profiles, maps, photographs, correspondence from the public. Hundreds of hours of work represented in manila folders and typewritten pages, and yet the essential mystery remained unsolved. Morrison had begun to explore theories that earlier in the investigation he would have dismissed as too speculative. Desperation bred creativity, or perhaps merely grasping at increasingly unlikely possibilities. One such theory involved railway workers. The affected neighbourhoods all lay near railway lines or stations. Perhaps the phantom worked for the railways, his employment giving him legitimate reasons to be in multiple locations at odd hours. Railway workers moved through the city according to schedules that might explain the timing of attacks. They had knowledge of routes and access points that ordinary citizens lacked. Morrison assigned 2 men to investigate this angle. They interviewed station masters and signalmen, ticket collectors and maintenance workers. They examined employment records and duty rosters for the nights when attacks occurred. They found several men whose shifts could have provided opportunity, but detailed investigation eliminated each one. The railway theory dissolved like so many others before it. Another theory focused on medical students. The Royal Hospital in Lambeth trained doctors, and students there learned anatomy and surgical precision. They worked with sharp instruments and understood how to move efficiently in high-pressure situations. Several medical students lived in lodgings near the affected areas. Morrison personally visited the hospital and met with the Dean of Medical Education. The Dean was cooperative but sceptical. He provided a list of current students, along with their addresses and class schedules. Morrison's men checked each name against the attack timeline. 3 students lived on streets where attacks had occurred, but none could be connected to the actual incidents. Their alibis held. Their characters seemed sound. The medical student theory faded. A more disturbing theory suggested the phantom might be a policeman. This would explain his ability to avoid patrols, his knowledge of investigation methods, his understanding of how to avoid leaving evidence. It would explain why he seemed always to be one step ahead of Morrison's efforts. Morrison hated this theory but could not dismiss it entirely. He knew the force contained men of varying character. The war had required rapid expansion of police numbers, and standards had sometimes been relaxed. Not every constable was wholly trustworthy. Not every officer behaved with integrity in all circumstances. He approached this investigation with extreme discretion. He could not openly question his own men without destroying morale and inviting scandal. Instead, he quietly reviewed personnel files, looking for officers who lived in or frequently patrolled the affected areas. He cross-referenced duty rosters with attack dates. He watched for behavioural anomalies or signs of unusual stress. One constable drew his attention. Robert Finch, 28 years old, a veteran who had joined the force in 1919. Finch worked the Brixton area. He had been on duty or off duty at appropriate times for 7 of the attacks. He lived alone in a bedsit. He had been reprimanded once for excessive force during an arrest. His army record showed service in field intelligence, which meant he had training in stealth and infiltration. Morrison began unofficial surveillance of Finch. He had the man followed on his off hours, his movements tracked, his associates noted. For 2 weeks, Morrison's men watched and reported, and what they found was nothing incriminating. Finch went to work, went home, occasionally visited a pub or attended church. He showed no suspicious behaviour, made no unusual purchases, displayed no interest in young women with long hair. Morrison finally confronted Finch directly, bringing him in for an interview framed as routine consultation on patrol procedures. He studied the man carefully, watched for reactions, pressed gently on sensitive topics. Finch seemed genuinely confused by the attention, but answered all questions openly. He had no explanation for being in the area during multiple attacks beyond the obvious fact that it was his assigned patrol district. His bedsit contained nothing unusual. His character references from fellow officers were uniformly positive. Morrison had to release him without charge. Another theory exhausted, another possibility eliminated, and still no meaningful progress. The public continued to offer theories of their own. Letters arrived daily at Scotland Yard, each proposing some explanation for the phantom's identity and motives. Many were obviously the work of cranks or attention seekers, but Morrison had learned not to dismiss anything without at least cursory investigation. Occasionally genuine insight emerged from unexpected sources. One letter suggested the phantom might be a wig maker or supplier of false hair. The trade in human hair was substantial in 1922. Wigs and hairpieces were common for theatre, for fashion, for covering thinning hair or baldness. High-quality human hair commanded good prices. Perhaps the phantom was harvesting hair for commercial purposes, supplying illicit stock to wig makers who asked no questions about sources. Morrison investigated London's wig-making establishments. He spoke with suppliers and craftsmen, inquired about the market for human hair, learned how the trade functioned. What he discovered was that while human hair was indeed valuable, it had to meet specific standards of length, texture, and condition to be usable for wig making. Hair cut randomly from sleeping women would not necessarily be suitable. Moreover, the quantities taken in the attacks were small, a few handfuls per victim. Any commercial operation would require much larger volumes. The wigmaker theory seemed economically implausible. Still, Morrison kept it in mind. Economic rationality did not always govern criminal behaviour. Perhaps the phantom collected hair not for immediate sale, but for some longer-term purpose. Perhaps he was gradually accumulating stock. Perhaps the commercial angle was secondary to psychological motivation, but provided convenient justification in the phantom's own mind. Another correspondent suggested the attacks might be politically motivated. Suffragettes before the war had sometimes engaged in property damage and militant action to draw attention to women's rights. Perhaps the phantom was making some perverse political statement about women's vulnerability, or women's changing social roles, or the tensions between traditional and modern femininity. This theory had some surface plausibility. The attacks did specifically target independent young women. The act of cutting hair could be read symbolically as an attempt to diminish or control female autonomy. But the theory broke down under closer examination. The suffragette movement had been militant but never cruel in this particular way. Their targets had been property and institutions, not vulnerable individuals. Moreover, the women's rights movement had generally supported female independence and would not engage in actions that terrorized women or justified calls for restricting their freedom. Morrison dismissed the political theory, but noted how it reflected broader anxieties about changing gender roles. The case had become a canvas onto which people projected their own concerns and beliefs. Some theories ventured into the realm of the supernatural. Several letters suggested the phantom was not human at all, but some form of spirit or demon. These Morrison filed away without investigation. He dealt in facts, not folklore. But even as he dismissed supernatural explanations, Morrison could not entirely ignore the almost otherworldly quality of the phantom's actions. The man moved through locked houses like a ghost. He worked in absolute darkness with perfect precision. He never made mistakes, never left traces, never faltered. It was not supernatural, but it approached the limits of human capability. This led Morrison to consider the possibility of exceptional training. Perhaps the Phantom had been specially trained in stealth and infiltration during the war. Intelligence officers, commandos, men selected for dangerous missions behind enemy lines. They received training that ordinary soldiers did not. They learned to move silently, to work in darkness, to enter secured locations without detection. Morrison requested access to military records for special operations personnel who had served in intelligence or commando units and now resided in South London. The War Office was reluctant to provide such information. These records were classified, the veterans entitled to privacy, but Morrison pushed hard, invoking public safety and the seriousness of the investigation. Eventually, a limited set of files arrived, heavily redacted but containing basic service information. He found 19 men in the target area with special operations backgrounds. Each was investigated, each was interviewed, each ultimately cleared. Some had solid alibis, some had physical disabilities that precluded the necessary agility, some had moved away or died since demobilization. The special operations theory, like so many others, led nowhere. By January, Morrison had investigated dozens of theories, followed hundreds of leads, interviewed scores of suspects. His notebook contained pages of speculation, diagrams of possible connections, timelines and maps and psychological profiles. But speculation was not evidence, possibility was not proof, and the Phantom remained unidentified. The attacks continued with maddening regularity. January brought 5 more incidents. The victims fit the established pattern: young, long-haired, living alone or in boarding houses, in ground-floor rooms with accessible windows. The method never varied. The intruder never made the mistake Morrison desperately needed him to make. Morrison began to wonder if the case might truly be unsolvable. He had read about such cases in criminology journals. Crimes where the perpetrator simply never made an error large enough to enable identification. Perfect crimes, though Morrison hated that phrase. Nothing about these attacks was perfect. They were violations, cruelties, acts that damaged lives and spread fear. But from an investigative standpoint, they approached perfection in their execution. The thought filled Morrison with despair. He tried hard not to show his men. If he gave up hope, if he allowed his discouragement to become visible, the entire investigation would collapse. He needed to maintain the appearance of confidence even as privately he acknowledged the possibility of failure. He stood in his operations room one cold January evening, alone with the case files and the map of red pins. 26 attacks had become 31. The constellation had grown denser, spreading across new neighborhoods. And still the pattern revealed no clear signature, no identifying mistake, no opening through which Morrison might finally grasp his quarry. Outside, the winter darkness had fallen hours ago. Somewhere in that darkness, the Phantom moved through London, scissors in hand, selecting his next victim, according to criteria known only to himself. And Morrison, despite all his efforts and dedication and accumulated knowledge, remained powerless to stop him. Chapter 7. The Psychology of Hair. Dr. Edmund Hartley was 46 years old and had studied psychological medicine at the University of Edinburgh before the war. He had served in France as a psychiatrist treating shell-shock cases and had returned to civilian practice with a reputation as one of London's more forward-thinking alienists. When Detective Inspector Morrison contacted him in early January, seeking consultation on the Phantom Barber case, Hartley agreed immediately. They met in Hartley's consulting rooms in Harley Street, far from the working-class neighbourhoods of South London where the attacks occurred. The contrast was striking. Here the streets were wide and well-lit, the buildings elegant, the residents prosperous. Violence and violation seemed distant concepts in this world of brass nameplates and polished door knockers. Morrison brought his files. He spread photographs and statements across Hartley's desk, building a comprehensive picture of the case. The doctor studied the materials in silence for some time, occasionally making notes in a leather-bound journal. Finally, Hartley spoke. "You must understand, Inspector, that what I can offer you is theory rather than certainty. The human mind remains largely unmapped territory. We have frameworks for understanding, but they are provisional, subject to revision. That said, there are patterns here that suggest certain possibilities." Morrison nodded. "I will take possibilities over nothing, Doctor." Hartley steepled his fingers, adopting the posture of the lecturer he had once been. "Let us begin with hair itself. Why hair? What significance does it hold that would drive a man to such elaborate efforts?" He paused, gathering his thoughts. Hair occupies a peculiar position in human psychology and culture. It is simultaneously part of the body and not part of the body. It grows from us but can be cut without pain. It is dead tissue, yet we treat it as living, as expressive of identity and personality. Women especially are taught to cultivate their hair, to regard it as essential to their beauty and femininity. Morrison had heard such observations before, but he let Hartley continue. In many cultures and historical periods, women's hair has been associated with sexuality and erotic power. Religious traditions often require women to cover their hair, precisely because uncovered hair is seen as sexually provocative. Married women in some cultures cut their hair upon marriage, symbolically transferring their sexuality from public display to private possession by the husband. Hartley picked up one of the victim photographs, a young woman with long dark hair, photographed before the attack. "Your phantom takes hair from unmarried women, young women, women with particularly long or beautiful hair. This suggests to me that the hair itself holds symbolic significance for him. It represents something he desires, or something he wishes to control, or perhaps something he resents." "Fetishism?" Morrison asked, though he already suspected this would be Hartley's diagnosis. "Possibly. Sexual fetishism involves the displacement of erotic interest from appropriate objects, namely adult human beings and consensual relationships, onto inappropriate objects or body parts. Hair fetishism is well documented in psychological literature. Some men become sexually aroused specifically by hair, particularly long female hair. They may seek to touch it, smell it, possess it." The doctor leaned back in his chair. "Your phantom is unusual even among fetishists. Most men with such inclinations either find legal outlets, so they become hairdressers, they marry women with long hair, they purchase hair from willing sellers, or they engage in minor boundary violations like touching strangers' hair in crowds. Your man has developed an elaborate method for obtaining hair through stealth and violation. This suggests the violation itself may be part of what satisfies him." Morrison made notes. Could he be aroused by the fear, by the power he holds over these women? "Quite possibly. Power and control are often central to sexual disorders. The phantom enters women's most private spaces, approaches them at their most vulnerable, takes from them without consent. These actions assert dominance. They demonstrate his ability to violate boundaries with impunity. For some men, this exercise of power is as important as the object they obtain." Hartley rose and moved to his bookshelf, withdrawing a thick volume. Krafft-Ebing's Psychopathia Sexualis documents numerous cases of what he terms sexual perversion. Men who derive pleasure from causing fear or pain, men whose arousal depends on non-consensual elements, men whose desires have become attached to specific objects or scenarios. Your phantom likely fits somewhere within these categories. "But why does he never escalate?" Morrison asked. "If he were truly driven by desire for power or domination, would we not expect him to progress to more serious violence, rape, or murder?" This was the question that had troubled Morrison from the beginning. The phantom's restraint seemed inconsistent with the psychology of most sexual criminals. Hartley nodded thoughtfully. "An excellent question. Several possibilities suggest themselves. First, the violation of cutting hair may fully satisfy whatever need drives him. He obtains what he desires without need for further action. Second, he may exercise conscious control, recognizing that escalation would increase the risk of capture, he has found a method that provides satisfaction while minimizing danger. The doctor paused. Third, and perhaps most interesting, the hair itself may be a substitute for something else he desires, but cannot allow himself to take. The cutting of hair, performed with such gentleness and care, may represent a sublimation of other urges. He touches these women, yes, but only their hair. He takes from them, but leaves them physically unharmed. Perhaps there is some conflict within him between desire and conscience, between what he wants and what he can morally permit himself to do. Morrison considered this. So he might be aware that his actions are wrong. He might experience guilt or shame. Possibly. Many individuals with psychological disorders maintain some degree of insight. They recognize their thoughts or behaviors as abnormal, even as they feel compelled to continue them. This internal conflict can sometimes lead to highly ritualized behavior. As the individual develops strict rules to govern their actions, Hartley gestured toward the case files. Notice the consistency of your phantom's method. He never deviates. He cuts hair but takes nothing else. He works in darkness. He departs immediately after obtaining what he came for. This ritualization suggests someone who has established firm boundaries for himself. Perhaps these boundaries help him maintain the fiction that what he does is not truly harmful, or is at least less harmful than what he might otherwise do. What about the war? Morrison asked. Could military experience explain any of this? We know he has skills that suggest training. Hartley's expression grew somber. The war damaged many men psychologically. I treated hundreds of cases during my service. Shell shock, what some are beginning to call war neurosis, manifests in countless ways. Anxiety, nightmares, tremors, amnesia, paralysis, speech difficulties, and yes, sometimes in altered sexuality or aggression. He returned to his chair. War exposes men to extremes of violence and powerlessness. They witness terrible things. They perform terrible actions. Some men cope by compartmentalizing, by separating their wartime selves from their peacetime identities. But the separation is never complete. The trauma bleeds through in unexpected ways. Could the phantom be acting out some war experience? Morrison pressed. Some trauma that manifests as this particular behavior? Hartley spread his hands in a gesture of uncertainty. Perhaps, but I would caution against assuming direct connection. Trauma does not simply replay itself. It transforms, symbolizes, displaces. If your phantom is a war veteran, his current actions might bear no obvious relationship to his wartime experiences. The connection, if it exists, would be psychological rather than literal. They discussed other possibilities: the influence of childhood experiences, family dynamics, early encounters with sexuality, the potential role of mental illness beyond simple neurosis. Might the phantom suffer from a psychotic condition that distorted his perception of reality? Could he believe his actions were somehow justified or necessary? Hartley thought not. The precision and planning evident in the crime suggested intact reality testing. The phantom knew what he was doing was illicit. He took careful steps to avoid detection. This was not the behavior of someone in the grip of delusion. What we have, Hartley concluded, is likely a man of at least average intelligence who has developed a paraphilia, an atypical sexual interest, focused on hair and the act of taking it from sleeping women. This paraphilia is strong enough to drive him to take significant risks, but it is bounded by some form of internal control that prevents escalation to violence. He has skills that facilitate his crimes, possibly acquired during military service, and he has managed to maintain his activities for several months without a capture, suggesting careful planning and perhaps some understanding of police methods. Morrison felt both enlightened and frustrated by this analysis. It provided a framework for understanding the phantom's psychology, but offered little practical help in identifying him. "Is there anything in this profile that might help me find him?" he asked. Hartley considered. He likely lives alone or has significant privacy in his residence. He needs somewhere to keep his trophies, the hair he has taken. Men with fetishes typically preserve and revisit the objects of their obsession. He may work in a field that requires precision and steadiness of hand. His military skills suggest previous service. Possibly in a specialized role, he's probably between 25 and 40 years old, as younger men would lack the skill and older men the agility required. Morrison already knew most of this. It described thousands of men in London. Look for someone who seems ordinary, Hartley added. Men who commit crimes like this are often described by neighbours as quiet, unremarkable, solitary, but not obviously disturbed. They maintain a facade of normalcy while nursing their secret compulsions. The phantom walks among ordinary people without attracting notice. He may be someone you have already interviewed and dismissed. This last observation haunted Morrison as he left Hartley's consulting rooms and made his way back across London to Scotland Yard. Someone he had already interviewed and dismissed. How many men had he questioned in the past 3 months? How many had seemed innocent, ordinary, beyond suspicion? The psychological profile helped him understand the phantom, but did not bring him closer to catching the man. An understanding without capture served only to deepen Morrison's sense of failure. He knew now what drove the phantom, could imagine the internal landscape of need and compulsion and ritualized control that governed his actions, but knowing the psychology did not reveal the face, did not provide the name, did not stop the next attack from occurring. That night Morrison sat in his office long after his men had gone home. He reread Hartley's notes, studied the victim's statements with new eyes, tried to see patterns that psychological insight might reveal, but the work felt increasingly futile. The phantom had become almost abstract in his mind, a symbol rather than a person, a puzzle that could not be solved. Somewhere in London the phantom slept, or did not sleep. Perhaps he too struggled with what he was, with the compulsions that drove him, with the knowledge of the fear he caused. Or perhaps he felt nothing beyond the satisfaction of the needs fulfilled. Morrison had no way of knowing. The man remained as invisible as ever, separated from capture by his own carefulness, and Morrison's inability to penetrate the mystery. The investigation continued. Men followed leads, interviewed suspects, patrolled the threatened neighbourhoods. But Morrison had begun to understand what he would not admit aloud to anyone. They were not going to catch the phantom Barber through conventional police work. They could only hope he would make a mistake, or tire of his activities, or move away, or die. Beyond that, they were helpless, and women would continue to wake in terror, finding their hair taken in the night, living thereafter with the memory of violation and the knowledge that the man who did it had never been caught, never been punished, never even been identified. Chapter 8. The Final Visit. The cold came hard in the first week of February. Snow fell on London for 3 consecutive days, unusual for the city, transforming the soot-stained streets into something almost beautiful. The snow-muffled sound created a hush that settled over the neighbourhoods like a held breath. In South London, where fear had become a constant companion, the snow brought a strange sense of reprieve. Surely the phantom would not venture out in such weather. Surely the snow would preserve his footprints, would finally provide the evidence Morrison desperately needed. But the snow also created new vulnerabilities. It piled against windows, blocking views. It provided a soft surface that absorbed sound, and it drove people deeper into their homes, made them close windows tight against the cold, made them sleep more heavily beneath extra blankets. On the night of February 8th, the temperature dropped below freezing. Ice formed on the inside of window panes. The gas lamps burned with halos of frozen mist. The streets were empty except for a few unfortunate souls hurrying home from late shifts, their breath steaming in the frigid air. In Balham, on a quiet residential street called Boundaries Road, a young woman named Catherine Price prepared for bed. Catherine was 22 years old and worked as a seamstress for a dressmaking establishment in Clapham. She had read the newspaper accounts of the phantom Barber with growing unease. But Balaam had been largely spared his attentions. Only one attack had occurred in her neighbourhood back in November, several streets away from her lodgings. Still, she took precautions. She checked her window locks before retiring each night. She kept a heavy candlestick on the table beside her bed. She had asked her landlord to install a better bolt on her door, and he'd complied. These measures gave her some comfort, though not enough to dispel entirely the anxiety that accompanied darkness. Her room was on the ground floor of a converted Victorian house. The window looked out onto a narrow side passage between her building and the next. Not an alley exactly, but a space just wide enough for a person to walk through. During the day it received almost no sunlight, remaining perpetually in shadow. At night it was utterly black. Catherine had considered requesting a different room, one on a higher floor or facing the street. But this room was larger than the others available, and cheaper by 2 shillings a week. She needed the extra space for her sewing work, which she often brought home to complete in the evenings, and she needed the savings. Money was always scarce. That night she worked late on a dress commission, stitching delicate beadwork onto silk by lamplight. Her eyes ached by the time she finished, and her fingers were sore. She was tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. The winter months had been long and dark, and the constant background fear of the phantom wore on everyone who lived in South London. Even those not directly affected felt the weight of it. She put away her sewing materials and changed into her nightdress. She brushed her hair, dark brown and falling nearly to her waist, counting the strokes as her mother had taught her. She said her prayers, asking God for protection and peace. She turned down the lamp until the flame guttered out, leaving the room in darkness. The bed was cold. She curled into herself beneath the blankets, waiting for warmth to accumulate. Outside she could hear the occasional sound of wind rattling a loose shutter somewhere down the street. Otherwise the night was silent. The snow had created a deadness in the air, an absence of the usual urban sounds. Catherine drifted towards sleep slowly. She was not naturally anxious, but the events of recent months had trained her to remain half alert even while resting. She surfaced periodically from the edge of sleep, listening, checking mentally that all was well, then sinking back down again. She did not hear the window being worked open. The sound was too quiet, too careful, and the snow that had drifted against the base of the window muffled what little noise there might have been. What woke her was the sensation of cold, a draught of frigid air moving across her face, carrying with it the smell of ice and coal smoke. Her eyes opened in the darkness. For a moment she was confused, still half in dream. Then full consciousness returned, and with it the realization that something was wrong. The cold air meant the window was open. But she had checked the window before bed. She always checked the window. Her heart began to hammer in her chest. She lay perfectly still, barely breathing, listening with every fibre of her being. And there it was, the sound she had feared for months. The soft, deliberate whisper of metal on metal, scissors being tested, once, twice, preparing for their work. Terror flooded through her system. She wanted to scream but could not draw breath. She wanted to move but found herself paralyzed. The nightmare that had haunted so many other women was now her own. She felt the weight at the edge of her bed, felt the mattress dip slightly as he positioned himself for better access, and then, with a gentleness that made her skin crawl, she felt fingers lift a section of her hair. The scissors began to cut. Snip, snip, snip. Each sound was crisp and precise in the frozen silence. Catherine squeezed her eyes shut, tears streaming down her face, unable to do anything except endure. The cutting continued methodically. He worked from one side of her head to the other, gathering locks, severing them cleanly near the scalp. His breathing was quiet but audible now that she was listening for it. Steady, calm, unhurried. He was taking his time. More time than he usually took based on the accounts Catherine had read. Perhaps the cold had made him bolder, the empty streets giving him confidence that he would not be interrupted. Or perhaps there was something about her hair specifically that pleased him, that merited extra attention. Catherine's mind raced through possibilities. Should she scream now, try to fight, reach for the candlestick she kept beside the bed. But terror kept her immobile, and some survival instinct whispered that compliance was safer than resistance. He had never hurt anyone beyond the cutting itself. If she remained still, if she allowed him to take what he came for, he would leave, and she would be alive. The cutting continued. Catherine lost track of time. It might have been 5 minutes or 15. The cold air from the window made her shiver despite the blankets. She could feel goosebumps rising on her arms, could smell the man's scent now that he was so close. Tobacco and wool and something else, something sharp she could not identify. Finally, the scissors stopped. She felt him gathering up the severed hair, collecting his prize with the same care he had used in taking it. She heard the rustle of fabric as he placed it somewhere, perhaps in a bag or his coat pocket. And then something happened that had never happened before in any of the previous attacks. The man spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper, hoarse and low, but the words were clear. "I am sorry." Catherine's eyes flew open in shock. She saw nothing except darkness, but she knew he was still there, still beside her bed. The apology hung in the frozen air between them, inexplicable and terrible. Before she could respond, before she could move or scream or do anything at all, she heard him retreat, heard his footsteps moving across the floor with surprising speed, heard the window being pulled down, though not quite closed, and then silence. Catherine lay frozen for several heartbeats more. Then she lunged for the matches and lit the lamp with shaking hands. The room sprang into view, empty except for herself and the evidence of his visit. Great sections of her hair lay scattered across the pillow and blankets, dark strands against white linen. When she raised a trembling hand to her head, she felt the ragged remains of what had been nearly waist-length hair. She began to scream. Her landlord arrived first, followed quickly by other lodgers. Someone ran for the police. Within an hour, Detective Inspector Morrison himself was at the scene, having been summoned from his bed when word reached Scotland Yard that the phantom had struck again. Morrison interviewed Catherine while she was still in shock, knowing that details would be freshest in those first hours. She told him everything she could remember. The cold, the scissors, the methodical cutting, and most importantly, the words he had spoken. "I am sorry." Morrison made her repeat it several times, ensuring he heard correctly. This was new, unprecedented. In 26 previous attacks, the phantom had never spoken, never made any sound beyond the whisper of his scissors. Why break that pattern now? What had changed? He examined the window carefully. The lock had been worked open from outside, just as in all the other cases, but there was something different here. In the snow on the narrow passage outside, Morrison found what he had been seeking for months. Footprints. The snow had stopped falling several hours before the attack. The footprints were clear and well-defined, preserved in the frozen surface. They showed the phantom's approach to the window and his departure. Morrison studied them by lantern light, his breath misting in the cold air. The prints suggested a man of average height and build. The stride length was unremarkable. The depth of impression indicated moderate weight, nothing distinctive or identifying, but they were evidence, physical evidence connecting the phantom to this location at this time. Morrison had the prints photographed and measured. He followed them as far as he could, but they disappeared where the passage joined the main street and foot traffic had churned the snow into anonymous slush. Still, it was more than he had obtained from any previous scene. He returned to the house and continued his interview with Catherine. Was there anything else she could remember? Any detail, no matter how small? Catherine struggled to articulate what she had sensed. The man's breathing had been regular, controlled. His hands had been steady and sure. He had moved with confidence and precision. But those words, "I am sorry," suggested something beneath the surface. Regret, compulsion, some awareness that what he did was wrong. Morrison asked about the man's scent. Catherine described tobacco and wool and something else, something chemical or medicinal. Morrison made careful notes. Many men smoked. Many wore wool coats. But the chemical smell might be distinctive: hair tonic, cleaning fluid, medical spirits. He asked Catherine to think about whether she recognised the voice. Even as a whisper, might it have been familiar? Someone she knew in passing, someone from her street or workplace? Catherine shook her head. The voice had been too distorted by the whisper, too brief. She could not say whether she had heard it before. Morrison left as dawn was breaking, the winter sun casting long shadows across the snow-covered streets. He carried with him photographs of footprints and pages of notes, and the knowledge that something had changed. The phantom had spoken. He had broken his own pattern. Perhaps the perfect discipline that had kept him undetected was beginning to crack. Back at Scotland Yard, Morrison assembled his team. They studied the new evidence with renewed energy. The footprints were analysed. The voice was discussed. The apology was dissected for meaning. Was the phantom feeling guilt? Was he struggling with his compulsions? Might he be approaching the point where he would stop or confess or make the mistake that would finally reveal his identity? But days passed, and no new leads emerged. The footprints matched no existing records. The chemical smell suggested nothing specific. The apology remained an enigma, offering psychological insight but no practical path to identification. And then, as February moved into its second week, something remarkable happened. The attack stopped. 1 week passed with no new incidents, then 2 weeks, then 3. Morrison waited tensely, expecting the pattern to resume, but no reports came in. No young women woke to find their hair taken. The phantom had vanished as suddenly and mysteriously as he had appeared. Chapter 9. The silence that followed. The silence was almost more unsettling than the attacks had been. For 4 months, South London had lived with the certainty that the phantom would strike again. Each quiet night had been merely a reprieve, a temporary pause before the next violation. The rhythm had become grimly predictable. An attack every few days, sometimes 2 in a single night. The phantom moving through his territory with methodical persistence. And then nothing. February passed into March. The snow melted, and the days began to lengthen. Spring arrived tentatively, bringing pale sunshine and the first green shoots in window boxes and small gardens. And still no new attacks occurred. Detective Inspector Morrison maintained his investigation at full intensity through the first month of silence. He could not allow himself to believe it was over. Criminal patterns did not simply stop without reason. Men driven by compulsion did not suddenly cease their activities through force of will alone. Something had changed, something had happened, and Morrison needed to understand what. He developed several theories about the phantom's disappearance. The first and most hopeful was that the man had died. Death would explain the sudden cessation cleanly and completely. Morrison had his men check death records for South London, looking for men of appropriate age who had died in early February. They found several possibilities. A railway worker killed in an accident, a shopkeeper who succumbed to pneumonia, a veteran who took his own life. Each was investigated. Each ultimately proved to have no connection to the case. The second theory was that the phantom had been arrested for some other crime. Perhaps he was sitting in Brixton prison awaiting trial for an unrelated offence, his true identity as the phantom unknown to the authorities. Morrison reviewed arrest records carefully, cross-referencing with his list of previous suspects and persons of interest. Again, nothing emerged that seemed promising. A third possibility was that the phantom had left London. Perhaps his work had taken him elsewhere, or personal circumstances had required relocation. This would be difficult to verify, as Morrison had no central registry of everyone who'd moved out of South London in February. But he made inquiries through various channels, checking with employers and landlords in the affected areas about tenants or workers who had recently departed. The most disturbing theory was that the phantom had not stopped, but merely changed his methods or location. Perhaps the intensive police attention in South London had driven him to other parts of the city, or to other cities entirely. Morrison contacted police forces across Britain, asking whether they had experienced similar incidents. Most responded negatively, but a few reported cases that bore superficial resemblance. Women finding hair cut during burglaries, for instance, or scissors left at crime scenes. Morrison, investigated these reports but found no convincing evidence of connection. The incidents lacked the precision and ritual that characterized the Phantom's work. As the weeks of silence accumulated, the public's attention began to shift. The newspapers, which had devoted enormous coverage to the case during the height of the attacks, now had new sensations to pursue. The Phantom Barber slipped from the front pages to the inside sections, from daily coverage to weekly retrospectives. By April, most papers had stopped mentioning the case unless new developments occurred. This shift in attention troubled Morrison. He feared that public pressure on his superiors would ease, that resources would be redirected to other priorities, that the case would be allowed to go cold before it was truly solved. He argued strenuously for maintaining the investigation at full strength, but budgets were always limited and political will was fickle. By late March, 2 of his men had been reassigned to other cases. By April, the Special Operations Room was closed and the files boxed for storage. Morrison refused to let go. Even as official resources dwindled, he continued working the case in whatever time he could spare from his other duties. He re-interviewed witnesses, hoping fresh perspectives might reveal overlooked details. He revisited crime scenes, walking the streets at night as the Phantom had done, trying to think as the man had thought. He maintained correspondence with Dr. Hartley, discussing psychological interpretations and theoretical possibilities. But theory and speculation were poor substitutes for evidence and arrest. And as spring deepened into early summer, Morrison had to confront the reality that the case might never be solved. The Phantom Barber had committed at least 27 confirmed attacks, had violated the safety and dignity of dozens of young women, had terrorized an entire section of London, and had simply stopped. No arrest, no confession, no resolution. The victims themselves struggle with the ambiguous ending. In some ways, the silence was worse than the active threat had been. When the Phantom had been attacking regularly, there was at least the possibility that he would be caught in the act or make a mistake that would lead to identification. Now there was nothing. No closure. No justice. Just the gradually fading attention of authorities and public, and the private knowledge that the man who had violated them lived somewhere in the city, unknown and unpunished. Some of the women had moved away from London entirely, unable to remain in the city that held such traumatic memories. Others had tried to rebuild their lives in place, finding new lodgings or returning to family homes. A few had married quickly, seeking the protection of a husband after the terror of living alone. All of them carried the experience with them, a wound that might heal over time but would never entirely disappear. Catherine Price, the final known victim, suffered perhaps most acutely. She could not forget the apology the Phantom had whispered. Those 3 words haunted her more than the actual cutting had. What had he meant? Why had he spoken? Was she truly the last victim, or would he return? The not knowing was corrosive to her peace of mind. She found herself watching men on the street, studying their movements, listening to their voices, wondering if one of them might be him. The barber who cut what remained of her hair. The grocer who sold her bread. The man who lived 3 doors down and worked nights. Any of them could be the Phantom. All of them were suspects. She lived in a state of permanent vigilance that exhausted her, mentally and physically. By summer she could bear it no longer. She left London and returned to her parents' home in Devon. She never worked as a seamstress again. The sight of scissors, even for innocent purposes, triggered panic attacks. She eventually found employment in a bookshop, work that required no sharp implements, no intimate proximity to strangers. She never married. She never told anyone except her mother what had happened that February night. Other victims coped in their own ways. Some threw themselves into work, using busyness to avoid reflection. Some sought comfort in religion, finding in faith an explanation or acceptance that secular understanding could not provide. Some became advocates for women's safety, joining or forming groups that lobbied for better street lighting, stronger locks, more police protection. Some simply tried to forget, pushing the memory down as far as it would go, building new lives on top of the buried trauma. Morrison watched these attempts at recovery with a mixture of admiration and guilt. He had failed these women. That was the simple truth he could not escape. They had been violated on his watch, while he was supposedly protecting them, and he had never caught the man responsible. His superiors did not see it as failure exactly. The attacks had stopped after all. The Phantom was no longer active. The public had moved on. From an administrative perspective, the case could be filed away as solved through circumstance, if not through arrest. No one was holding Morrison personally responsible for not catching a criminal who had displayed almost supernatural skill at evading detection. But Morrison held himself responsible. He had devoted 4 months to this case, had worked hundreds of hours, had pursued every lead and explored every theory. And yet the Phantom had remained always one step ahead, always invisible, always beyond reach. It was the greatest failure of Morrison's career, and it would haunt him for the rest of his life. In June, Morrison wrote a final report on the case. It ran to 70 pages, meticulously documenting every attack, every piece of evidence, every suspect investigated, every theory pursued. He concluded with his assessment that the perpetrator had likely died, moved away, or been incarcerated for other reasons, and that, absent new evidence, the case should be considered inactive but not closed. The report was filed at Scotland Yard along with the boxes of evidence and interview transcripts and photographs. It joined the archives of unsolved crimes, a mystery that would puzzle future generations of detectives and criminologists. Morrison was reassigned to other cases. He continued his career with distinction, solving murders and robberies and frauds. He was promoted to chief inspector, then to superintendent. He had a long and successful tenure with the Metropolitan Police. But he never forgot the Phantom Barber, never stopped wondering who the man had been, why he had done what he did, where he had gone when the cutting stopped. In his retirement, Morrison would sometimes visit the Public Records Office and pull the case files. He would spread them across a table and study them again, looking for patterns he might have missed decades earlier. He never found anything new. The mystery remained intact. South London gradually returned to normalcy. The fear that had gripped the neighbourhoods for those dark months faded into memory. New residents moved into the boarding houses and converted flats, unaware of the history. The streets became safe again, or at least as safe as city streets ever are. Women walked home alone after dark without the terror that had once accompanied such journeys. But the memory persisted among those who had lived through it. The older residents remembered. They told the story to newcomers, to children, to anyone who would listen. The Phantom Barber became part of local folklore, a cautionary tale about the dangers that could lurk in familiar places, about the vulnerability of independence, about mysteries that remained forever unsolved. And somewhere in London, if he still lived, the Phantom himself carried his own memories. Did he think about the women he had violated? Did he feel guilt or satisfaction or merely puzzlement at his own compulsions? Did he understand why he had stopped? Or had the cessation been as mysterious to him as it was to everyone else? These questions had no answers. The Phantom had taken them with him into silence, and the silence held them still. Chapter 10. The Mystery Unsolved. The case of the Phantom Barber entered the permanent record as file number 1922-22847 in the Metropolitan Police Archives. The designation was bureaucratic, impersonal, giving no indication of the fear and violation and obsessive investigation contained within those cardboard boxes. To the archivists who processed the material, it was simply another unsolved case among thousands, worthy of preservation but not special attention. But to those few who studied it in later years, criminologists and historians and true crime enthusiasts, the Phantom Barber case represented something unique in the annals of criminal behaviour. Here was a perpetrator who had committed dozens of violations over several months, who had demonstrated remarkable skill and planning, who had terrorised an entire section of a major city, and who had simply vanished without ever being identified or apprehended. The case became a subject of academic study. In 1935, a monograph appeared in the Journal of Criminal Psychology, analysing the Phantom's methods and possible motivations. In 1947, a chapter in a book about famous unsolved crimes provided a comprehensive overview. In 1958, a BBC radio programme devoted an episode to the mystery. Each retelling added speculation and theory, but no new facts. The essential mystery remained intact. Various theories about the Phantom's identity were proposed over the decades. Some researchers believed he had been a war veteran suffering from psychological trauma. They pointed to the timing, 1922, only 4 years after the armistice, and the specific skills demonstrated, suggesting military training in stealth and infiltration. This theory had the virtue of explaining both the competence and the eventual cessation of attacks, as the veteran might have recovered stability or relocated for treatment. Others proposed that the Phantom had been a foreigner who returned to his home country in early 1923. This would explain the sudden cessation and the complete absence of similar crimes in subsequent years. Perhaps he had been a temporary resident of London, here for work or study, who departed when his visa expired or his assignment concluded. A darker theory suggested the Phantom had escalated to more serious crimes and been executed or imprisoned for murder. Proponents of this view argued that the psychological drivers behind the haircutting would not simply disappear, that compulsion of that intensity would demand outlet. If the Phantom had not been caught for his original crimes, perhaps he had been caught for something worse under a different investigation. Still others believed the Phantom had simply aged out of his criminal behaviour. Psychological disorders sometimes diminished with time. The compulsions that drove a man in his 20s might fade in his 30s or 40s. Perhaps the Phantom had lived out the rest of his life as an ordinary citizen, his terrible secret known only to himself. One particularly intriguing theory emerged in the 1960s when a researcher discovered that several of the victim locations had been scheduled for demolition and redevelopment in early 1923. Perhaps the Phantom had been a property developer or surveyor who had legitimate access to these buildings during the planning stages, and whose activities ended when the projects were completed or cancelled. This theory was compelling but ultimately unverifiable, as the relevant business records had been destroyed during the Blitz. The victims themselves, those who survived long enough to be interviewed by later researchers, offered little help in solving the mystery. Most had tried hard to forget the experience. They were reluctant to discuss it, uncomfortable with the continued public interest in their private trauma. The few who did agree to interviews could add nothing to what they had told Detective Inspector Morrison decades earlier. The man had been invisible to them then and remained invisible now. Catherine Price, the final victim, lived until 1984. In her later years, she gave a single interview to a BBC researcher working on a documentary about unsolved London crimes. By then she was an elderly woman, her hair long since gone completely grey. She spoke carefully about that February night, choosing her words with precision, still reluctant to fully engage with the memory. "I have thought about it many times," she said. "Those 3 words he spoke. I am sorry. What did he mean? Was he apologising for what he was doing to me? For what he had done to all of us? Or was he apologising to himself for being unable to stop? I shall never know, but I think about it still." The interviewer asked whether she had any theory about why the attack stopped. Catherine was silent for a long moment. "I like to think he died," she said finally. "'Tis terrible to wish death upon anyone, but I like to think he died shortly after that night, and that whatever compelled him died with him. It gives me some peace to imagine he cannot still be out there somewhere, living an ordinary life, remembering what he did. Does that make me a wicked person?" The interviewer assured her it did not. Wanting resolution, wanting justice, even in the form of natural death, was entirely understandable. Catherine nodded. "Sometimes I wonder if I was truly the last, or if there were others after me in different cities, and no one connected them. The world was larger then. Communication between police forces was poor. He could have moved to Manchester or Glasgow or Dublin and continued. And we would never know. That thought disturbs my sleep even now, 60 years later." She died 6 months after giving that interview, with her death the last living person who could testify to a direct encounter with the Phantom Barber passed from the world. Detective Inspector Morrison had died in 56. His retirement years spent gardening and reading detective novels, and occasionally revisiting the case files that had defined his career. He never spoke publicly about the Phantom Barber, maintaining professional discretion even in retirement. But his personal papers, donated to the police museum after his death, included a journal entry from 1953 that revealed his private thoughts. "I am an old man now," he wrote, "and my hands shake when I try to write. My memory is not what it was, but I remember the Phantom Barber as clearly as I remember anything from my years of service. I remember the victims' faces. I remember the map with its constellation of red pins. I remember walking those streets night after night, hoping to encounter him, knowing I probably never would. I failed those women. There is no other way to say it. I devoted everything I had to catching him, and it was not enough. He was simply better at hiding than I was at finding. Perhaps he is dead now. I hope he is. I hope he suffered before he died, though I know such thoughts are unworthy of a Christian man. But mostly I hope he has simply gone from the world, unable to hurt anyone else. I have investigated many crimes in my career. I have seen terrible things, but the Phantom Barber haunts me in a way that murders and robberies never did. Perhaps because he was never caught. Perhaps because the mystery remained forever unsolved. Or perhaps because his crimes, though not violent in the conventional sense, violated something fundamental about safety and privacy and trust. He made women afraid to sleep in their own beds. That is a special kind of cruelty. I shall die without knowing his name, and that knowledge, that failure, will follow me to the grave. The journal entry was the last substantial addition to the historical record of the case. After Morrison's death, interest gradually waned. The case appeared in encyclopedias of unsolved crimes, in books about London history, in occasional articles about the psychology of serial offenders. But it faded from public consciousness, becoming a footnote to the more sensational crimes of the era. The streets where the Phantom had operated were transformed by time and progress. The Victorian terraces were renovated or demolished. The neighbourhoods gentrified or declined and gentrified again. New residents came who knew nothing of what had happened in those rooms decades earlier. The physical evidence of the case disappeared. The map with its red pins, the victim photographs, the carefully preserved locks of hair that had been taken as evidence, all eventually lost or destroyed or misfiled in bureaucratic reorganisation. What remained was story, a mystery that had never been solved. A man who had moved through London like a shadow, leaving violation and fear in his wake, and who had vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared. The factual details were documented in archives that few people consulted, but the essential story, the terror of waking to find a stranger's hands in one's hair, the skill and precision of the attacks, the complete failure of authorities to stop or identify him, that story endured. It endured because it touched something fundamental about vulnerability and violation, about the thin barrier between safety and danger, about how quickly the familiar could become threatening, about the limits of law enforcement and the persistence of mystery, and it endured because it remained unsolved. Human beings crave resolution. They want stories to end properly, with justice served and questions answered. The Phantom Barber offered no such satisfaction. He appeared, committed his crimes and disappeared, leaving behind only damaged lives and unanswered questions. Perhaps he died in February of 1923, as Catherine Price hoped. Perhaps he moved away and lived, quietly somewhere else. Perhaps he was imprisoned for other crimes under a different name. Perhaps he simply stopped, his compulsions fading with time or will or circumstance. The truth died with him, whoever and wherever he was. The case remains officially unsolved in Metropolitan Police records. The files are still accessible to researchers who request them, though they are consulted rarely. The story is retold occasionally when writers or filmmakers search for obscure crimes to dramatise. But mostly it sleeps in the archives, a mystery from another era, a reminder that some questions never receive answers. Somewhere in London, perhaps, there are still elderly people who remember the winter of 1922, who remember the fear that gripped South London, who remember checking windows and barricading doors and lying awake in the darkness, listening. Their numbers dwindle each year. Soon there will be no one left who lived through those months when the phantom stalked the neighbourhoods with his scissors, and then the case will be entirely historical, no longer living memory but only recorded fact. A story that once terrified an entire city will become merely another curiosity for those interested in criminal history. The fear will be unimaginable to future generations who never had to lie awake wondering if tonight would be the night a stranger climbed through their window. But the mystery will remain. That cannot be erased by time or the passing of those who remember. The phantom Barber will continue to haunt the historical record, a man without a face or name who violated dozens of women and was never caught. His identity, his motives, his ultimate fate, all lost to history. The candles burned low in those Victorian rooms long ago. The women slept or tried to sleep. The man came in the darkness with his scissors and his terrible, gentle precision. And when it ended, when the last cutting was complete and the silence fell, the mystery settled over South London like fog from the Thames. It has never lifted, and perhaps it never will.